In this video, I'll be sharing everything I learned about war sails in the last 150 hours of playing. A huge shout out to Tailworlds for sponsoring this video and supporting this channel. Now let's get into the guide. Let's start off by talking about the most important stats of a ship, starting with the crew. The skeletal capacity is the minimum number of troops you need to move on the map without a movement speed debuff. In this case, we have 10 crew capacity. If we have only 9 or less, we will suffer a movement speed penalty on the campaign map. If we have at least 10 or more, we will not suffer a movement speed penalty. The deck capacity is the maximum number of troops that you can have out fighting at any given time. Now you can see here in this ship, the deck capacity is 35, and it also happens to correspond with the same number of max capacity. If we come over here to our heavy ship, you could see 88 is the deck capacity, and 132 is the max capacity. That means this ship can hold 132 soldiers, but you can only have 88 of them out at a time to fight. Now, if you have 132 soldiers on the ship, 88 of them will be fighting, and as soon as some of them die, some will come up from the cargo hold to replace them until you've exhausted all 132. Now, if you go over this max crew capacity, so in this case we have 132 troops, if we had 150, we would be over the max capacity. We would also be suffering a movement speed penalty on the campaign map. Now, one important tip here, if you plan on doing a lot of naval combat and you want to capture enemy ships, make sure you have as many troops as you can to fill the captured ships up to the skeletal capacity. In this case, we have a skeletal capacity of 10 for each of the fishing ships, so 20 total, and then 44 here for the heavy ship. That means we need at least 64 troops to man these without having a movement speed debuff. If we want to capture new ships, let's say we want to capture more fishing ships, every fishing ship would need at least 10 people above the 66 that we already have in order to move without having a movement speed penalty. Now, typically in the early game when you have only a small, maybe one ship, you can maybe take 1 or 2 at a time without having a massive movement speed penalty. If you're fighting against pirates, you can also just pay them off to tell them to go away. But in general, it's better to not go too far over or too under your skeleton crew capacity or your max crew capacity. Next, let's talk about cargo capacity. So each ship has a separate cargo capacity limit, which can be upgraded with upgrades from the ship. In this case, this fishing ship is just the base 2500, which is actually really high for a small ship that can only require 10 crew. If we look at our heavy ship, it requires 44 crew and it barely holds 2000 cargo capacity. Now, there are upgrades you can do that will increase it. However, this is a warship and I wanted to go with other upgrades that increase other things. But be aware, you do have a limited supply of cargo capacity when you're on ships. Let's go over to our inventory, and you can see there's actually 2 separate numbers. One while you're on the ship, which is the 3 numbers that we just covered, and then you have the cargo capacity if you were to go on land with the exact same amount of gear you have in your inventory. Now, on land, adding mounts and adding pack animals will actually increase your cargo capacity here while you're on land. But you'll notice that it increases the weight that you have while on ships. So you can't just go on and add as many mounts as you want. So in this case, we would need 130 mounts for our foot troops to be riding on if we want to have the max movement speed on the campaign map. We barely have any mounts here, not even enough to hold everybody, and most of these are pack animals, which we need to hold our inventory. So you can see you have to be a little bit more selective with what you're using for your loadout. If you're going on land and you need max speed, maybe going on boats is not the best idea. Maybe just use the boats to travel around and not so much to fight on, because you're going to be moving super slow and catching any enemies is going to be really tough. However, if you're going to be mostly maritime, you can forego the mounts and move slow on land, but then do most of your attacks either through ports or just leaving the sea and quickly getting back to your ship. Next, let's talk about the weight. So the ships in Bannerlord war sails are all modeled off of physics. I believe there's a couple things that aren't specifically modeled, but just about everything else is, which means weight plays a large role in how the ship moves, and as well as how much momentum it has if you're trying to ram people, how hard it is to pull a ship in if it weighs a lot. So essentially, the more weight you have, the more momentum you'll have when you ram into somebody. But if it's heavier, it's also harder to move if you don't have enough either oar power or sail speed to get that thing up and moving. You can see here on the low end, we've got a fishing ship which weighs 60,000, and the big heavy ship weighs roughly 250,000. So it's a pretty big difference. And obviously it'll make a big difference when you're trying to grapple and board a ship like this versus a small fishing vessel. Up next, let's talk about travel speed. This number is the base movement speed that your ship will travel on the campaign map. You can see here our fishing ships have a default rate of 3.0 movement speed, but we've got 2 upgrades. We've got the oar speed, a travel speed of plus 8%, and then the ore speed travel of plus 6%. So these two upgrades bring it from 3.0 up to 3.42. So pretty big increase. And then our heavy ship does also have some upgrades. I believe the base movement speed of this is 2.8. And then with the ore speed, as well as the sails upgrade, we can get up to 3.08. Now, if we go to our actual movement speed here, party movement speed base is 3.19. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of other modifiers in there, which we'll cover in another section, shallow draft, culture, etc. That's not what this number is talking about. This number is the base movement speed. So if you take the average of these ships, so we have 3.42, 3.42, and 3.08, that's where your base movement speed comes from. So if you have really big ships that are super slow, you might want to dilute their movement speed with some of these faster, lighter ships so that you can get some movement speed on the campaign map. Now, if you dilute yourself too much, you won't have any room for your crew to be able to take ships that are captured back. So be aware, you want to have a nice balance between a lot of crew members, but also a lot of ships that are kind of fast, and then a decent amount of ships that can actually fight. Whereas in most battles, I would not take these fishing ships in. I would leave them mostly for the cargo capacity and also the travel speed buffs that they provide. So that is basically travel speed without talking about the other bonuses, which we'll cover in just a minute. Next, let's talk about the draft. There's two different types. There's shallow and there's deep. Shallow is meant to be sailed on rivers and close to the coastline, whereas deep is meant to be sailed in the open ocean where the bottom of the ocean is way far down. Obviously, these are better in shallow waters because they don't have as much of the boat in the water. They have more of a flat bottom. Whereas the deep ones, they go deeper in and they can handle deeper waters. Now, what does it mean in terms of Bannerlord? If you have a shallow draft, you're going to get more of a bonus. You can see we have shallow draft at plus 0.15 because we have two boats that are shallow and they do get more of a bonus there. If we go on to the open water, you can see here we get open seas of plus 0.13, but we have a debuff of shallow draft minus 0.15. So shallow draft boats aren't meant to be sailed in the open sea, and deep draft boats aren't necessarily meant to be sailed exclusively along the coasts or through the rivers. So depending on what kind of sailing you're planning on doing, you probably want to adjust your ship type based on that. Now, in general, most of the sailing you'll do here, especially if you're doing combat, most of it's going to be in the shallow water along the coastline because that's where most enemies patrol. The fishing ships will go out to deep sea, but they always come back to the coastline. So most of your combat, especially in the early game, is going to be here. If you're looking to do a lot of long distance traveling, say if we want to go from Balgard all the way over to Havalvik, this is going to be way faster if you go in the open ocean. You can see here, our movement speed along the coast was around 3.8. If we go in the deep sea, it increases all the way up to 6.0, which is basically if you're riding on land with full mounts. So this is like a cavalry force on land. Very, very fast. So just kind of adjust your ships based on what you're planning on doing. Or in my case, I have a mix of the two so that I can take advantage of both without really min-maxing both ends. Next, let's talk about seaworthiness. This number represents how much damage you can resist while sailing on the open seas. In this case, our fishing ships have a seaworthiness of 40, while our big battleship has a seaworthiness of 47. Now, this isn't the whole story. Shallow drafts will take more damage while in the open seas as well, whereas the big ships don't take damage in the coastal seas. They will still take damage in the open seas, but it's a huge difference. So you can see here I've traveled for a couple screen lengths worth, and our fishing ships have taken damage all the way down to 86% health, whereas our heavy ship is barely down to 98%. So it took very little damage traveling from Greatest Fjord all the way to the middle of the ocean. So just be aware, having higher seaworthiness does help you resist the open ocean, but even more important than that is the draft type that you're going to be using. So if you're going to be traveling a lot on the open waters, try not to have too many with shallow drafts, and if you can, get some of the upgrades. You can see here on our heavy, we have a upgrade that increased our seaworthiness by plus 15, which is quite a lot. It also increased weight and top speed, which is nice, but the seaworthiness is what we're talking about. There's several other upgrades that can do it as well if you look at all the different upgrades, but the main one is going to be the hull on the bottom. So if you upgrade the hull on the bottom, you can increase your seaworthiness quite a bit. Some ships do not really have any upgrades. So for example, this fishing ship only has oars and sails that you can upgrade, neither which will increase the seaworthiness. So these will always take a lot of damage when in the open water. Next, let's talk about hit points. On the low end, a light ship will generally have around 10,000 hit points, a medium ship around 20, and then the heavies right around 60,000. See, at 58k, and if we go back, there's some more over here. 61, and 58. Now, there are some upgrades you can do that increases your hit points. You can see our Droman actually has 66,000, and that's because we have 2 upgrades that increase hit points by 5%. So if we come over here to the ram, we get a 5% from this. And then the barracks, we get another ship hit points of 5%. So we have 10% more. This one defaults, I believe, at 60k. Now, on the low end, you can go even lower than that. You can't buy fishing ships, but if you wanted to use these in combat, just be careful. They will go down very fast. They only have 4,000 hit points. With that said, ships are actually not that easy to sink. You do have to do quite a bit of concerted effort to actually sink one. I've got the Firepot Ballista here. It takes maybe 20 or 30 shots to down a ship if you use just this. Now, if you ram it, it also can do a decent amount of damage. So a good ram I've seen on the high end will do about 8 to 10,000 damage. So you can do a decent amount of damage. If you have a big heavy ship like this against a small ship, you could probably take it out one go. However, a big ship, it's going to take a lot of work to down them. So I wouldn't worry too much about hit points. Other than maybe on the low end, maybe your light ships, you might want to keep them out of battle so they don't get rammed too much. Next, let's talk about ship upgrades. You can see here on the low end, our fishing ship only have 2 upgrades, which are these 2 squares right here representing. And because they're gold, this means they have the best possible upgrades in these slots. You can see here our oars. They give us travel speed and oar speed. Travel speed is campaign map. Oar speed is when you're actually in combat. So the amount of thrust you get from your oarsmen. And over here, travel speed is campaign map. Sail rotation speed is in combat. So these will basically help you in 2 different ways. If you go on the low end, the cheaper upgrades, they only help you in combat or they give you less bonus. You can see this one is only 2%, whereas on the high end, it's 6%. So quite a bit more. And then on the higher end, the bigger ships, this is the one that has basically every possible upgrade. And you can see here, there's a lot of different options you can take. There's different front ends you can do for the heavies. So if you want to do damage that is mostly geared towards hitting crew, you can do that. There's ones that are better for dealing damage to ships. There are ones that set ships on fire, so they're decent against both crew and a little bit for the ship itself. There's upgrades here you can do that will increase the amount of soldiers you can have on here. So this by default has only 120 max crew capacity, but because I went with an upgrade, it actually increased it to 132. So you can actually squeeze more people on these ships. And there was another upgrade here, the reinforced barracks, so I can actually get another 10% on top of that. So instead of 132, it would go up to, I believe, 144. So if you really wanted to max out the amount of troops you have, especially for a lot of archers, or if you're trying to board an enemy ship, having max crew capacity would actually be really helpful in that case. So you can go for that. I decided for this one to go with the ballista because it's pretty fun to use. There's other upgrades you can do. In this case, you can have a ram that also increases your top speed, your travel speed on the campaign map, hit points, etc. This one is basically going to give you seaworthiness, more weight for when you try and ram people, but it also make your boat a little bit slower, and then your increased top speed. Another very important upgrade is shields that will help protect your rowers. So in this case, we've got the best possible shields. They've got a decent amount of coverage here, and they have a lot of hit points, and it increases crew shield hit points by 50%. So not only do you get protection here physically on the ship, but it also increases the shield hit points of the crew members. Now, typically shield hit points, especially on land, not really the most important stat. However, on ship battles, it's super important because the AI especially will spam units that have javelins. Javelins are really, really important when you're fighting on the sea. And if you lose your shields, they're going to be sitting ducks and they will go down very fast. So having extra crew shield hit points is actually pretty good to have. Normally, I wouldn't recommend it, but on the open waters, highly recommend it. And then obviously we talked a little bit about this earlier, but you can have increased amounts of quivers that you have on your boat. So we have quivers and throwing weapon stacks. So this will help keep your crews and yourself restocked in battle. On the high end, you can have units that have 10 throwing javelins, but if you're going to fight a protracted battle, you will go through 10 very fast. So having free reloads for them is pretty helpful. It'll increase the amount of combat effectiveness that you have on the open water without having to sacrifice all your guys by going into melee all the time. There's other upgrades here you can do on the ship deck. So this will increase your seaworthiness and your cargo capacity. So if you're finding yourself limited here, you can go for this. However, what I would recommend instead of increasing your cargo capacity on the big ships is to use other ships to supplement your cargo capacity, because you don't have to take a ship into battle if you have it in your fleet. You get to choose which ships you want and which ones you don't want in battle. So for example, I've got these fishing ships I talked about earlier to increase the travel speed, but also it gives a lot of cargo capacity without using up a lot of the crew. So this is really helpful to increasing and supplementing your cargo capacity without having to use up some of those precious upgrades. So like I said, you want to have quivers and throwing weapon upgrades for your troops instead of having to spend it on cargo capacity. But if you're trying to do a trading run and you only want to use the big ships, I guess you could technically do that if you really wanted to. And then obviously you've got the sail upgrades. Those are pretty self-explanatory. These roof upgrades are purely cosmetic. They literally do nothing. So if you can see here, there's no upgrade on them. They don't really help you in any way. So I'm a cheap bastard. I don't pay for one, even though we've got more money than we can use. And then you've got figureheads. I have not figured out how to unlock these, but once you do get these unlocked, they do offer effects for your specific ship. As you can see, the ore force plus 15%. So you can have increased ramming speed if you're not relying on the wind, or if you need to get away from enemies. Boarding enemy morale. There's some really good ones on here. There's one that increases crew melee damage. Also ramming speed. That one's pretty good. Fire resistance. Yeah, boarded enemy crew melee damage, and then crew ranged accuracy. Some of these are really good depending on what you're trying to do. And you can really customize if you want to have a specific ship for boarding, another specific ship to sail around and let your archers get some damage on them from flanks. You can really customize these. But that basically covers the upgrades on different ships. Now let's talk about capturing an enemy ship. Here we've got a trader convoy that is getting attacked, so we'll hand over all the goods. We want everything, and then we're just going to auto-resolve this so we can end it quickly. You need to get past the prisoner screen, get past the loot screen, and then you'll have the option to take their ships into your own hold. Now, if the ship took too much damage in the fight, you will actually sink them and you won't have the option to capture these. I tried to do this before with fishing ships and with pirate ships, and they all sunk when I auto-resolved. So if you fight it in person, just make sure you don't ram the ships, don't hit it with fire, don't do anything that's going to cause a lot of damage to it, because it will add up. And I believe by default, ships take an extra 50% damage when you go from post-battle to capturing. So if it already started off at around 50%, it's just, even if you do no damage to it, it's just going to automatically sink. I believe they do that to balance the game. I could be wrong on that, but either way, when you want to take the ship into your own control, you go ahead and select here, take, and you can see it moves over to our own inventory. Now, this ship is going to need to have some repairs. It already has some upgrades as well, so that'll be good. Or we could just straight sell it if you want to make a bunch of cash. But you can see here, as we talked about before in the crew, if we have enough crew to man this without having a speed debuff, that would be ideal. And you can see here, we are not overburdened. We're within the limits of our crew max capacity. We need 10, 20, and 44, so 66 plus 24, 90. We need 90 troops. We have 114, so we're still in good shape there. Now, when you go back to port, you want to go to your manage fleet section if you want to sell these things, or if you want to repair it and upgrade it. But if we click on our White Serpent, this is the one we just got in combat, and you can see it's going to cost us 5,256 to repair. We can sell it for 10,281. Now, if we repair this thing, let's see if we actually would make a profit if we were to sell it, repair it, and then sell it. And you can see here now it's worth 15,538. So it's roughly equivalent. I don't think you take any loss by repairing them. And if it is, it's very small, but you also don't gain much by doing that. But you can see here, this thing does have some upgrades. So the AI does a decent job with their upgrades. Some of these are the lower tier ones. You see the brown ones. These are the tier 1. They go all the way up to tier 3 on how good they are. So brown, silver, and gold. So this would actually be a pretty decent ship if we didn't already have a heavy like this. But yeah, as it stands, let's just sell it. We'll make our 15K and move on. In the next section, let's talk about some of the new troop types. So here you can see these units have this little wavy symbol underneath them. This is the Nord troop lineup. And this wavy symbol means these units are mariners, which means they can fight on water without suffering a combat penalty. If you have regular troops that are not mariners, they will be able to fight on boats, but their combat effectiveness will be drastically reduced. Their swing speed is less. I don't know if they do less damage, but their swing speed is way slower. So if you have an equivalent tier 1 unit that is a mariner and a tier 1 unit that is not a mariner, the mariner will win pretty much every time against the non-mariner, even if the stats and the gear are equivalent, just because they don't get that huge debuff. So looking here at the Nord lineup, you can see every single thing here is a mariner. And that also includes their noble lineup, which is actually an infantry unit. It's the only infantry in the game, a melee infantry in the game that is a noble line, going all the way up to the Huskarl, and you can see these guys are meant to be fighting on the open waters. Now, with that said, the Fiend Champions are probably still the best unit to have if you're looking to min-max. These guys are incredible on the water because they can attack at range. They are going to be susceptible to attacks from javelins, so if you can, keep them a little bit further away. So if you're trying to min-max, you could still spam these guys. And if you're looking for the best non-Nord and non-Fiend champion unit that is best to use on the water, I would have to say it's the Imperial Naute. If you look at their stats, they're not anything to write home about, only 130 and all the relevant combat stats. However, if you look here at their equipment, they have a hooked javelin which does 117 pierce damage. They have stacks of 5 and they have 2 of these. So they can throw 10 javelins that could just about one-shot most troops in the game. If not, everybody would be dead in 2 shots. So if you spam these Naute, these guys will absolutely clean up. I did have to rewrite this section of my script a little bit just because it was patched recently. I believe it was yesterday. So the Nord troop lineup was quite good in terms of skills, but their equipment was lacking. That has been addressed. So these guys now have hand coverings and they have proper armor. Before, I believe their body armor was around 30 or 35. Now they have 52 body armor. These guys are actually legit, and I highly recommend using these troops now. They can go toe-to-toe with anybody on land, and nobody can even come close to them on the water, except for maybe Fiend Champions, but we all know the AI never spams Fiend Champions in large numbers. So anything on water, these guys will clean up for you. And let's talk about some of the other troops that these guys can use, because the Nord lineup is quite unique. You'll notice there is a distinct lack of cavalry. There are no mounted units in the Nord lineup. You can go down either the melee or the ranged route. The ranged route is a linear tree going all the way down to the Nord Sky Gods. These guys are very, very accurate. Especially on water because they are mariners, and the mariner stat does help them with their accuracy. If you have an equivalent archer but they're fighting on water and they're not a mariner, they will significantly underperform relative to these guys. The biggest downside here is they only have 1 stack of arrows, and it looks like they did change this in a patch as well. So before they had a stack size of 20, now it's 32. I will definitely be using these guys a lot more now. So I'm glad they made that change. And for the rest of the lineup, they've got regular shielded infantry. They have a berserker axe, so they do have a 2-handed axe they can use. They've got a shield and then a set of throwing axes, which I'm not really a fan of. I don't really like these guys that much in combat, and they tend to have very weak head armor. You can see here, only 22. The bear skin is a little bit stronger, 24, and then this one's the best at 34. So they have some decent equipment loadouts, but in general, these guys are not all that great. I would much rather have the noble lineup if you can get them, even though they're a bit more expensive. Now, they do have 2 different types of shock troops. You've got one here that has a hollow axe, and then you've got one here that has a polearm. This is the Ulfhednar Atgeir. I don't know how to pronounce that, but the Atgeir, this thing is pretty good at range. So if you want to take down cavalry, this is probably your best anti-cavalry in the Nord lineup. This is a pretty good option for anti-infantry. However, if you're going to go this route and you can get a bunch of them, just go for the noble trees. If you can't get a bunch of nobles because it's hard to find the units, these guys can actually supplement pretty well. I would probably not use the shielded infantry as much if you can. Obviously, it's better than not having shields, but yeah, these are kind of a backup. And then, like I said, spam the archers, they're good now. Now, real brief, let's talk about what the other faction have. I know I talked about what the best one is. We'll talk about what other factions have. So the Aserai has an archer that is a mariner. They don't have a melee infantry, so these guys are mostly going to be good for staying away from direct combat. I really don't recommend using them. I didn't really find them to be all that helpful. However, if you are going to be doing a lot of land combat and you're trying to stick to Aserai troops, if you're going to be on the water, it's better to have these than to have the Master Archer because they don't get that penalty when fighting on ships. Khazate is the only faction in the game that does not have a mariner troop, so these guys do not want to fight on water. So just avoid them if you're using their troops to do a mostly naval combat. I would probably go a different route. Vlandia is like Aserai. They have a ranged option in the Naute. These guys have a single quiver of only 18 bolts, so very limited in terms of firepower. They're half decent in melee, but I would not really rely on them in melee because their armor is a lot less. In general, the mariner troops are going to have lighter armor, but they will perform better than their counterparts on the water. Moving on to Sturgia, they do have also a mariner. However, they have throwing axes. Like I said before, I don't really care for these too much. They will get some kills, but I find them to be a lot less performative than their javelin counterparts. so I can't really recommend the Sturgeon Reaver. Not only that, but they default with a two-handed weapon, which means their shield is not going to be all that effective because it's going to be on their back. Again, if you're using Sturgeon troops, these guys are decent. If you're trying to find the best units in the game, probably stay away from these guys. On water anyways. And finally, we have the Battanian Mariner, which is the Battanian Skipari. Now, these guys are kind of similar to the Empire troop, the Naute. They do have 2 sets of hooked javelins that do 117 damage. I believe their combat stats are identical as well, so these could also be a decent troop. However, the Battanian lineup is a little bit harder to go through than the Empire troops. You can see here you have to go the Woodrunner, the Skirmisher, and then either the River Raider or the Skirmisher, the Veteran Skirmisher. I think the Empire lineup is a little bit better getting to this point. However, if you only have access to Battanian troops, these guys are decent as well. But I would say the edge still goes to the Naute of the Empire. Either way, these are decent troops that have 2 sets of hooked javelin throwing weapons. There are 2 ways to move your ship: rowing or having the wind in your sails. In regards to wind, it's best to have the wind at your back, but if the enemy also has the wind at their back when they're chasing you, you're on equal footing. When possible, position the enemy with a headwind and yourself with the wind coming from behind, allowing for the biggest difference in potential speed. Take into consideration what kind of sails your ships have and what kind the enemies have. Lateen sails are better for top speed and can outrun square sails even with the wind helping both sides, but square sails have a higher acceleration and can help catch up quickly going from a stop. If you've outfitted your ships with strong rowing oars, it might be best to sail into the wind to negate any sail advantage the enemy has and instead rely on stronger rowing power. Turning while moving forward is difficult, and the turning radius will be very wide and not as useful. For a sharper turn, paddle backwards to stop and you'll turn much faster. This can be very handy when going against a ship that has a lot of wind speed, where they won't be able to turn fast enough to catch you if you turn and move out of the way. Sometimes too much speed can be a bad thing. You can cut down on the number of rowers in order to have more people available to fight. This is particularly useful if you've got a lot of archers that are trying to row. It can help to a lesser degree with javelin troops as well. Once a ship is ready to board, rowers will abandon their position and automatically transfer over to fighting roles. But if you're trying to avoid being boarded and still getting plenty of damage off, make sure you toggle your rowers off. After you successfully board and clear a ship, don't forget to give the defend ship command to get everybody back on board, then and only then give the command to cut away from the other ship. If you cut away with troops still on the enemy ship, they will be dropped into the water and the AI often struggles to climb the ropes to rejoin the ship and they will die from drowning. When switching off of controlling your ship, your crew will continue to carry out your last inputs. So if you want to stop and shoot some arrows at an approaching ship, but don't want to get caught, make sure you're still holding the same move directions when you switched off. Likewise, don't switch off when you're turning or your ship will continue to spin in circles, unless that's your goal. Now let's move over to the ship combat tactics section, starting with bait and run tactics. You can load up on archers or throwing weapons, row to keep the enemy just out of distance, and kill the enemy. Most enemy parties will not load up on archers, so this is viable if you have a fast ship. The enemy will try its hardest to grapple and board your ship, so don't let them get too close. The problem is archers' accuracy at sea is bad, so you need to get close enough to get good shots, but if you're too close, you'll get boarded and owned by javelins. This is a viable but somewhat mediocre tactic in my opinion. Large ship bait and run. You can more effectively do this tactic with a large ship that has a ballista on the front. Row into the wind, turn your boat around, and row backwards into the wind. This will negate any sail advantage the enemy ships might have. Then switch to the ballista and start shooting at the enemy ships and crew. If you're up against multiple targets, try to sink the weakest ships first. If you're trying to capture the ships, try to target the enemy crew over damaging the ship's hull. Aggressively boarding blitz. My preferred tactic is to load up on solid javelin troops like the Empire Naute and quickly board enemy vessels. Sail directly towards them and press R to begin grappling when you're in range, and then press F3 to issue the charge command to your troops. The AI will generally run straight at you with their whole fleet, so it's best to position your ship on the outside of their formation to avoid being attacked from multiple angles. Section off the weakest one on the outside, and then continue to board the rest one by one. I didn't test large fleet battles as much as some of the smaller ones, but I find that aggressive boarding works here. But if you want to micro more, you can send a couple heavies down the middle with javelin troops and hold back other heavy or smaller ships loaded with archers. Once the heavies are engaged, circle around the outside with the archer ships to pour some arrows into their back. When it comes to personally commanding troops on your ship, you have three options. You can set them to defend the ship, which has them return to the boat to fight. You can have them charge in, which has them go to the enemy ships to fight, or you can have them follow you where they sort of follow you around. If you have weak troops versus the enemies, do not send them in to charge as they will die on the rope bridge with very few kills. It's best to have your troops follow you, move to the back of your boat, and wait for some enemies to cross the rope bridge. Then charge into them to clear them out, and move back again once it's clear. Be aware, if you stay up near the front for too long, your troops will no longer start following you and they will try to cross the bridge and go into the enemy side and you'll start losing them again. So it's a delicate balance between moving back, charging up, and moving back and repeating until they're all dead. Personal combat can be incredibly effective. Bows and crossbows are amazing since shots are usually at close range and there are a lot of enemy troops standing still for easy headshots. Javelins can be effective if you don't target shields from the front, like hitting them when they're on the rope bridge. Melee can be very effective as well, but mostly with a shield and one-handed weapons. Projectiles will kill you if you don't have a shield within seconds of being near the front line. They'll even hit you in the back, so it's always best to have a shield out. We touched on grappling and boarding a little bit earlier, but let's go into a little bit more detail. The number of grapples that are available on the ship will depend on the size of the ship, and with military large ships offering more hooks than a smaller fishing boat. A boat can potentially get away from being boarded if they get enough distance from their attacker. Rowing speed and sail power can help create the distance to avoid getting pulled in all the way. Also, you can issue commands to have your troops help grapple and board, or you can throw the hooks yourself. Moving around on land feels a bit slower now, so be prepared for a longer campaign. Ships are highly recommended for faster movement speed when you can afford them. You can disembark from your fleet at any port or along any coastal area that is traversable by foot. If you leave your ships on the coastline or a different port, then travel on land to a different port, you can recall your fleet with a single button. Even traveling across the entire map only takes 6 hours for your fleet to arrive. Some parts of the map are a huge pain to traverse in the early game, like Sturgia right here, or any Nord lands in the north. And finally, the Aserai lands are no longer connected in the southwest. The new island in the northwest is a great place to start your kingdom. It takes enemy armies weeks to respond to a siege up there most of the time, allowing you to capture the castle or town and start a kingdom. If you have the right army composition, defending against large armies on the water can be easier than defeating them on land. If you're looking to focus on naval combat, try to save up 15,000 to 20,000 dinars so you can afford a cheap ship and some upgrades. Start by attacking fishing boats first. You'll need around similar numbers to the enemy unless you have higher tier units. The next target you'll need around 30 to 40 troops and 2 small ships or 1 medium ship. You can target pirates that have taken damage. Fresh pirates have around 60 or more troops, while damaged ones usually in the 30 to 40 range. Or you can go near enemy towns and hunt down their coastal patrols, which are usually 40 troops strong. You could also attack merchant convoys, but make sure you have even more troops, as their archers can overwhelm you if you don't have enough shields. Once you can afford a large ship and 100 plus troops, you can take on any noble's ship and even some small army groups that don't have mariner troops. Now let's talk about the 3 new skills that were added: Mariner, Boatswain, and Shipmaster. Mariner is basically a skill that helps you reduce the combat penalties when you're fighting on a boat. So when I talked about earlier the troop trees, if you have a non-mariner troop fighting on a boat, they will fight significantly worse than a unit that has the mariner trait. This is basically the equivalent for characters, heroes, etc. So if you have this leveled up, you will be able to utilize your full combat skills on a boat, and if you don't have it leveled up, you're going to have some significant penalties here. Now this one is basically leveled up by fighting on ships, so just regular combat that you have to do, so not your troops, but your personal combat. So getting kills with melee or any kind of ranged weapon will level this skill up. And one thing you'll notice, if you look at any of the perks, we're not going to go over every single one because there's too many, but if you look at the numbers that they're giving, they're very solid compared to some of these other trees where you get maybe 5% or 4%. These ones are healthy. You get 25% melee handling for this one, 20% damage dealt by axes. There's some other ones, 15% while fighting on your ships, or 20% when fighting on other ships. This one, 50% armor penetration for ranged weapons, or 50 armor pen for melee weapons. So you could see they were not stingy at all with the bonuses that they give here. Now this one does not have a 275 perk, but it does have some really solid ones. I would say of the 3, this might be the most useful, definitely for personal combat, but I would say this one is probably one of the more impactful ones. However, I will say that they all have good perks. And also, I haven't tested this, but I don't feel like these perks are limited to only fighting on the sea. So if you're going to be doing some regular campaign on the land, you might want to pick up some of these skills as well. For example, this one gives you a 15% range damage up by character, or another 20% damage dealt by character with melee. So even if you're not going to be fighting too much on the water, if you can get this leveled up, you could take advantage of these perks even while you're fighting on land and pair it with some of these other skill perks. Next, let's talk about Boatswain. This skill basically reduces the amount of damage that you take when you're fighting on water to your ship. It's similar to armor on land. When you take a hit, you'll see a little pop-up right next to it saying that your damage was reduced by a certain amount. The Boatswain will do the same thing when your ship gets rammed or shot by projectiles or whatever that causes you damage. It also reduces damage in storms, so that can be a little bit helpful because storms can actually wreck your ships pretty fast. Now this one just got an update yesterday, so I had to go back and rework my script a little bit here, but you get this leveled up by taking damage to your ship. I believe it gives you a little bit by dealing damage to other ships as well, but you can now level it up by repairing your ships in port. Whereas before, this thing would level up incredibly slow. You can see here, my Mariner skill is already at 213. This one's stuck at 15, and I've had the same amount of skills in both of these at roughly the same amount of time, and you can see the learning rate is really high, but there's very, very little XP in this skill. But now that you're repairing your own ships and getting XP for it, I think it's going to actually increase the amount of XP gain drastically, so you can actually use some of these perks. Now, a lot of these perks revolve around saving money. So there's ship cost upgrades, repair cost upgrades. There's one down here that gives you more ammo. So 30% more ammo per stack for crew under command. So again, we talked about before, one of the big limiting factors with javelin troops, especially on ships, is the fact that they only have 10, even though that's a lot, they can go through it pretty quickly. So by doing this, they'll get an extra 3 shots. And technically, if you have the captain, it's an extra 2 ammo stacks for thrown weapons for the crew. So you actually get double the amount here. There's also perks here that give you a +1 ship to command limit. If you have too many ships in your party, you will start to suffer a movement speed penalty. So having this, and there's another one down here that gives you another +1 command limit to ships. This one, I guess this is just a straight command limit, and this is command limit in battle. So this one will help you with your movement speed while you're on the campaign map. And then finally, the 275 perk allows you to use the ballista from your ships to fire during sieges. So instead of having to build the 4 in the front of your castle, I believe you could just use your ships to do it if you want. And then finally, talking about Shipmaster. Now this one governs a bonus when you're moving on the campaign map on water. It will give you a slight bonus to your movement speed. You can see here, we got, believe it is party leader of 0.07 right now. So we have it leveled up to 39. And again, this one also got a patch recently. You could see it's only level 39 compared to our 213 Mariner. This one was doubled. So you will see a slight increase from this. I think they probably need to move it up a little higher than double. That may not be enough, but it's better than what it was before. And most of these perks revolve around campaign movement speed. You can see you could pick up another 2% travel while at sea, minus coastal movement speed penalty and things like that. And there's also some movement speed while you're in combat. So this one gives you a better sail force. This one gives you better rowing force. So if you're trying to get away from enemies and maybe use like an archer meta or the ballista on the front of the ship, but you don't want to get boarded, you can take these perks and then keep away from the enemy a lot easier. And then finally, the 275 perk, the flagship figurehead, provides the bonus for all the allied ships. So when we talked about the ship upgrades, you can get those ones at the top of the ship that will give you a bonus to everybody on the crew or the boat itself. If you take this perk, it applies that bonus to every ship in your fleet, even if they're little ones that don't even have the figurehead option to upgrade. Now this one is leveled up just by traveling on the map. To my knowledge, there's no other way to level it up. So just being on the sea will help you level it up. And you might be wondering how you get leveled up past the 5 focus points. And you'll notice here, because there's no dedicated attribute point for this, if you hover over Vigor, you notice that this one governs one-handed, two-handed, and polearm, but it also contributes to Shipmaster. Same thing with Intelligence. Intelligence also contributes to Shipmaster. And then same thing here, Control and Social, go to Boatswain. You can see there, and Control to Boatswain. And then the 2 inner ones, Endurance and Cunning, both contribute to Mariner. So if you want to get these leveled up to the max, you need to invest some attribute points into these categories. Now you'll see here, let's take a look at Mariner specifically. We have 8 points into Endurance. And you can see here, we have a learning rate of 5.88. So this one will definitely get to 275, although we don't need it for Mariner. I guess not the right example here. But if we wanted to push this learning rate even higher, we would have to put some points into Cunning to increase this learning rate further. It's sort of, I haven't worked out the math exactly, but it sort of takes the average between these two and applies it to your learning rate, as opposed to say like this one, it just straight takes only the 6 from here and applies it to your learning rate. You can see right here, attribute effect +3. Whereas if I look at my Mariner, you can could see attribute effect plus 2.5. So we're getting 6 from here, but only 2 from here. And so that's why it is less than what we do just on the vigor skills. It's not a huge hit, but it is definitely a hit. So on this one, not as big of a deal, but on Boatswain or Shipmaster, if you're trying to hit that 275, you would probably be better off putting it in both of these categories as opposed to what I did here and maxing out these top 3. I did this because my character is mostly in melee combat, but you could see I'm glad they did it so that it's 2 skills contributing to it. So you can do both a combat character, or if you wanted to have a general that was mostly providing bonus to your whole army, you could still do it by leveling up heavily down in these 2. Before you start your next campaign, I do recommend taking a look through each of the cultures because some of them did get a rework. I'm going to focus on 3 that I think are somewhat noteworthy, starting with Sturgians. So right now they have village grain production increased by 10%. This used to be something about cheaper upgrading for your foot troops, and they got rid of that and replaced it with village grain production. So essentially this is going to allow your villages to make more money by selling this grain to the towns. So you'll make a little bit more money from your villages, but it also, that grain will contribute to a higher prosperity production. So the towns in Sturgia should be able to gain a bit more prosperity and allow the Sturgians to make more money, allowing them to field more troops, etc., etc. So this is a good change. Next, let's look at Botania because they had a pretty big change here. So the first one is still the same. The speed penalty and sight range bonus in forest is still the same. Towns owned by Botanian rulers will have 20% chance of militias to spawn as veteran militias. Before, this would be a +1 to militia for towns. So now it is switched to 20% chance of spawning veteran militias instead. So basically, if you have 100 militia, you'll have 20% of them spawning as veterans and the rest as the regular tier 2s. Now, the tier 3 militia are actually quite strong, and so they will help contribute to both auto-resolve and combat in person. So I think this is a better change. I think you get a little bit more use out of it. Less numbers, but more higher quality. And so overall, I think it is a pretty good change. And then finally, this is not a change. This is just a brand new faction, which is the Nords. They get extra loot from basically fighting villagers, villages, and caravans. So anytime you're looting from these 3, you will get extra loot. 30% is a very significant difference. So making money with these guys in the early to mid game is quite a bit easier. You also get a 20% ship movement speed when you're in rivers or coastal seas. And this translates to, I think, around 0.15 or 0.25, somewhere in that range. So it's a pretty significant difference in your movement speed because your movement speed in the early game when you're not in the open seas is actually kind of slow on the water. It's usually around 3. So if you can go from 3 to say 3.2, it's a pretty big difference, almost 10%. And then the downside for the Nords is armies that are commanded by a Nord commander lose 30% more cohesion on land. So essentially, if you are calling armies from your vassals or your nobles and you want to use your influence to do so, you will have to spend 30% more to keep them tied up together. Your army will want to break up faster. Now let's talk about some of the cosmetic changes. There's 3 new hairstyles. You've got this really long ponytail. This is definitely a bit more Viking-like than some of the other long-haired ones. You've got the shaved head with the mini mullet in the back. I don't know what you call that, but I'm going to call it a mini mullet. And then long hair with the braids. Quite a bit of long hair up here in the base game, but this one does look pretty good, actually. I like this one a lot. And there's also some new facial hair. So there's 3 new ones at the bottom. So this one's got the 2 whiskers on the side with some kind of jewelry or whatever you call that. Same thing here, a little bit longer and closer together. And then the whole smattering of random beads. And I don't know what this represents. I'm sure somebody will tell me in the comments, but pretty cool. I really like that one, actually. I usually prefer to go this right here. So I think this looks really good. That's what my current character's at. And then when you're choosing your flag, if you scroll down about 1/3 or 1/4 of the way down, you'll see some new entries here. We've got these 2 rows and then a couple from this row. I believe it's 13 new flags. So you could see here, let's make this easier to see. So black on gold, some kind of dog, the Viking ship, all kinds of new designs, lots of birds, bird with a spear. This is probably one of my favorite ones. And then I don't know what these represent, but they look pretty cool. So 13 new designs for the flags. And there is 2 new trading items. There's whale oil, you can see right here, and this is the symbol for it. So it's a barrel with a whale tail. There's not too many of these around the map from what I could tell, only a handful, and it's a very expensive item. And there's also walrus tusks, which is basically 2 tusks. And you can see here, walrus tusks. Again, super expensive. I don't think this is quite as expensive as the whale blubber, but the walrus tusks are pretty expensive and you can make some decent money by selling those around. And then finally, we got to talk about a sore subject for Bannerlord for a very long time that I'm happy to say is much better, or at least, I don't know if I just got lucky, but I don't think so. I've done this at several towns and I've always gotten good results. So workshops are way more profitable now than they were before. I've got 4 here in this current playthrough. The worst one is providing just over 200 and the best is just shy of 400. And I've done this playthrough for about 6 years. And I bought my first workshop, I think 2 years in or so, and it's been very steady at those numbers pretty much the whole time. And these are using some ones that are traditionally not profitable at all. So breweries in the previous couple patches were awful. No matter where you bought them from, even if it was a town that should have made very good beer and profitable beer, it just would not make money. Now that is definitely fixed. The linen weavery is also kind of a weird one. Sometimes that doesn't do so well, but it's doing really well. And one I've never seen a wood workshop make money before. I don't know if this was bugged or whatnot, but it's way better now. So making very good money with the wood workshop because this one is tied to several hardwood villages. So it has the input and you can see here it is making very good money. And on the flip side with that, if you can get some profitable caravans or profitable workshops going, you will actually make money from that. So if you look here, we didn't do any trading in this run. Literally 0 trading, but we still maxed out our trading without any focus points or whatnot. But still, we got XP from our workshops. And so if you're planning on doing a trade run and you want to get a trade skill leveled up fast, make sure you get as many profitable things as you can. Workshops, caravans, your own trades, etc. And you will actually get XP for doing all that. So very happy that they changed that and added that. And that sums up what I've learned playing War Sails for the past few weeks. There's a ton of content here to explore and enjoy, and I can't wait to dive even deeper in the following months. Again, thank you to Tailworlds for sponsoring this video. And if you haven't picked up War Sails yet, there's a link in the description that will take you to it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.